So let's talk about an institution you've probably heard of, one that's been shaping our world for almost 80 years, spending billions to fight poverty. But what is the World Bank Group, really? What does it actually do? Well, let's get into it.
To really get what the World Bank is all about, you have to go back in time, and you have to start with a huge, almost impossible question, one that leaders were staring down at the end of the deadliest war in history. How do you even begin to fix a world that's been completely shattered?
And believe it or not, the answer they came up with was as bold as it was, well, strange. Their answer was a bank. Not just any local bank, but a global one, designed from the ground up to fund reconstruction on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
So, that's where our story begins, with the bank's origins, which were literally forged in the fires of World War II.
Okay, so back then, the World Bank's mission was laser-focused. It was created at this famous conference in Bretton Woods in 1944 with one main job: get loans out the door to help countries rebuild. Its very first loan, a whopping $250 million, went to France in 1947. But of course, the world kept changing, and the bank's mission, well, it was about to change right along with it.
And it wasn't just the mission that grew. The whole institution did. See, when we say the World Bank today, we're not talking about just one bank. No, it's actually a whole group of 5 different organizations. You can think of it like a financial toolkit for the entire planet.
So here are the tools in that kit. First up, you have the IBRD. That's the original bank, the one that makes loans to governments. Then, they added the IFC, which focuses on funding private businesses. And to help the absolute poorest nations, they created the IDA, which gives out grants and interest-free loans. And to make all this investing a bit safer, they added ICSID to settle disputes, and MIGA to offer insurance against political chaos. Put them all together, and that's the World Bank Group.
Okay, so you've got this massive organization with 189 member countries and billions of dollars flying around. It makes you wonder, right? Who's really calling the shots here?
Well, the answer is pretty simple, and honestly, pretty controversial. See, at the World Bank, not all votes are created equal. It turns out your power is directly tied to how much money you put in. Just take a look at this. The U.S. is the biggest shareholder by a long shot, so they control almost 16% of the votes. To put that in perspective, that is more than double the voting power of the next country in line, Japan.
So what does that power actually mean? Well, here's the kicker. Any really big change to how the bank works needs an 85% supermajority to pass. With the U.S. holding nearly 16% of the vote, well, you do the math. They are the only country that can single-handedly block any major reform. They basically have veto power. And the influence doesn't stop with the votes. It's an unwritten rule, a tradition, that the president of the World Bank is always an American citizen. And who nominates them? The President of the United States. Oh, and of course, where are the bank's headquarters? Yep, Washington, D.C.
Now, this massive concentration of power isn't just some abstract idea on a chart. It has had real-world consequences, and it led to some huge controversies, especially back in the 1980s. This was the era of something called structural adjustment.
So what were these SAPs? They were basically a set of really strict conditions that came attached to the loans. The idea, in theory, was to force countries that were in debt to, well, streamline their economies, cut back on spending, and get their house in order so they could compete on the global market.
So the thinking was, and this was pushed hard by the bank's most powerful members, that if you just applied free market ideas, privatize industries, shrink the government, you'd get stable, efficient economies. But what happened in the real world, that's where things got really complicated. Critics pointed out devastating social costs. Governments were often forced to slash funding for things like healthcare and education and cut the very subsidies that kept food affordable for the poorest people.
And the human cost was just stark. I mean, listen to this quote from a UNICEF report from the late 80s. They directly blamed these policies for reduced health, nutritional, and educational levels for tens of millions of children. That's wow. So the goal might have been economic reform, but the people who felt the impact the most were often the most vulnerable.
After all that backlash, and with the world facing totally new problems, the World Bank had to change. It had to evolve. And now, in the 21st century, it's pivoting to take on a whole new set of global crises.
I mean, the shift is just massive. This is an institution that was born to rebuild cities from the rubble of war. Today, it's trying to tackle huge, borderless threats like climate change and global pandemics.
We saw a perfect example of this during the COVID-19 pandemic. The bank moved fast,
mobilizing a staggering $12 billion to help developing countries get their hands on vaccines, tests, and treatments.
And then there's the other huge priority, climate change. The bank now sees it as absolutely central to its mission. As former President Jim Young Kim put it, climate change isn't just an environmental issue. He called it one of the single biggest challenges facing development.
And look, this isn't just talk. They're actually changing their policies. In a really big move, the bank announced it would stop financing new oil and gas exploration projects after 2019. That's a huge signal that they're serious about shifting away from fossil fuels.
So all of this leaves us with one big final question, right? The World Bank has gone from rebuilding a war-torn Europe to fighting a warming planet. It has constantly had to reinvent itself. But the real question is, can an institution designed for the problems of the last century really solve the incredibly complex, interconnected crises of this one? That's the ultimate test it's facing right now.